The chapel sat crooked on its knoll like an old jaw with a broken tooth. November had gnawed the countryside to gristle, pasture grass gone the color of pewter, the marsh a flat plate of ice, and the wind, thin, insinuating, threading itself through every loose clapboard of Ashcroft Chapel, until the whole structure sighed and clicked as if it were catching its breath. What white paint remained on the siding had curdled to a gray scab. The bell in the leaning steeple did not ring anymore. Its tongue had cracked 2 winters ago during a funeral that nobody mentioned afterward. Snow skinned over the steps, and the door, black from 100 hands and 100 more refusals, gave way with a reluctant hinge cry under the push of Evangeline Mercer. Inside, stale cold and the sweet, indifferent odor of old prayer books. Beyond the vestibule, the nave opened like the throat of a thing that had been swallowing for a very long time. On either side, rows of pine pews sloped inward, their ends carved with a sober Puritan thrift that seemed to darken under candlelight. The windows, tall thin lancets of glass webbed by frost, carried dim shapes of saints whose faces had been wiped of color from years of smoke. Down the center ran a runner of black burlap to the chancel rail, and beneath the altar, almost a roomer, a square iron door squatted with 4 riveted hinges and a handle polished bright by necessity. The furnace. Evangeline cradled a small, heavy bundle in her arms, the weight of it more ideal than flesh. The baptism cloth had been washed and boiled in lye until its threads went brittle and shone like a blind eye. She did not look at the bundle. To look was to remember. Her wrists, raw from winter and work, trembled against the cloth. The nails on her thumbs were split. There was a soot crescent under one nail she had not been able to scour away even with sand. "Proceed," said Reverend Josiah Barrow from the chancel shadows. His voice came thin through the chill, a wire pulled tight. He stood like a lamp left untrimmed, tall, wavering, the black of his suit swallowing the candle flicker while his collar gleamed with a kind of brittle righteousness. The hour advances. Purity abhors delay. Evangeline's mouth had been dry since midday. She worked her tongue over the roof of it and tasted ash. "Sir?" she said, and her voice sounded borrowed. Barrow took 1 step forward, then another, until the angles of his cheeks made 2 clean strokes of shadow down either side of his face. "Do not fashion it a cruelty when it is a mercy," he murmured. "We err most when we mistake feeling for charity." He had said it every time. Mercy, purity, charity. As if the words possessed their own heat. As if they had the power to cauterize. She moved toward the iron door. Under her feet, the plank floor had settled and buckled from years of damp. The nave gave off the cooled smell of tallow and human wool. She thought she could hear under all that the softest thrum. As if somewhere in the beams or under the joists, a nest of moths beat their powdery wings in prayer. It was the furnace, she knew. Even dormant, it announced itself to her palms and throat, a still, dark mouth waiting. No one else had stayed. Not the women who had stood at the back wall earlier, hands laced white against their skirts, eyes scoured clean of tears. Not the men who had refused to meet her gaze, talking of roads and rail and the new mill while their wives folded shut like chairs beside them. Only Evangeline and the Reverend remained for what he called the rite. He did not touch the cloth, never the cloth. He carried the Bible and the ledger. She carried everything else. She knelt and felt, even through her threadbare dress, the way the floor held cold like a mean thought. The iron door wore a fine fur of frost. When she pressed the latch with the meat of her palm, the frost made a quick nettling hiss against her skin. The door swung inward and the smell came. Coal and old oil and something sickly sweet that had nothing to do with fuel. There were embers like fox eyes back in the brick throat. If she leaned in, she could see the grate beyond, the ash below, the warped iron ring where the poker hung. The cloth shifted. Reflex, she thought, and then forbade herself the thought. The breath went out of her in a white rope. Barrow's shoes whispered on the boards behind her. "The law may dally," he said, "but God does not. We who would keep a people unspotted must be firm where they are weak." A gale found a seam in the window frame and moaned. The candle flames seized and bent. From the vestibule came the slow lick of the wind through the nail holes. There was a sound like water, but there was no water. Only the wash of blood in Evangeline's ears. She had known another kind of sound once. Laughs tumbling from other girls' mouths in the yard behind the Barrow house. The plank of the well-lid clapping. One child's thin voice trying at a hymn and abandoning it for a skipping rhyme. There had been an afternoon when her hair had smelled of sun, and the grass had stained the underside of her elbow green. And she had believed. No, not believed. Only failed to disbelieve that there might be a corner in the world where a warm hand would take hers and keep taking it. The bundle in her arms grew heavier. She did not know where to place her grief. There was no shelf for it that would not break. The Reverend's words sniffed around her like persistent dogs. She angled her body so he could not see the way her face had opened. "Evangeline," he said, and there was her given name, placed in his mouth like a coin. "This is not yours to carry into sentiment. Finish." She moved then because she could not bear to hold still. The iron lip of the door pressed against her forearms. The heat drew nearer, thin and metallic like the radiance of a winter-stayed skillet hung too close to the fire for too long. She slid the bundle toward the glow. The cloth caught on a burr of metal. She freed it with a careful finger. Her throat worked once, twice, and then everything in her steadied like a glass after a hand leaves it. It is not a child, she told herself. It is not anyone's child. It is a word, a rule, a decree wrapped in cotton. It is a ledger entry waiting for Deacon Phineas Crowthorne's neat hand. It is a service performed. It is a mercy if a man with a book says so. She pushed. The cloth met heat. The smell rose. A small sound, not a cry, only the air making its old arrangements as it changed, moved through the grate. The embers brightened and settled. The iron rung rattled against the brick. Somewhere in the chapel a beam creaked as if shifting its spine after a long stillness. Barrow's breath whistled once, satisfied. "The smoke of innocence ascends," he said. The stain abates. Evangeline closed the door. The latch clicked and held. She sat back on her heels and put both hands flat on her thighs to keep them from showing him the tremor gathered there. The cloth, now gone, still weighed her arms with an ache that did not know how to evaporate. Afterward, there were small things to do. Sweep the errant ash from the altar rail so it would not leave stamps on Sunday gloves. Pinch the candle wicks so they dimmed without sputtering. Wrap the poker in oilcloth and lay it across the iron rest as if it were only a tool and not a sentence. She did each precisely. With the same care she might have given a fevered infant. Cool cloth, measured laudanum, a finger across the brow to count the return of breath. Because care was all she had left that she could still give without the Reverend owning it. He watched her as if he were counting. She had caught his eyes doing that before. When he preached about Romans, about vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy, his gaze often found her, slid briefly over her hands, her mouth, the bare slope of the collarbone where her dress had thinned to thread. It was a hunger so disguised as righteousness that sometimes she had to look twice to recognize it. He snapped the leather strap around the ledger and shut the Bible. "You will attend Mrs. Barrow at first light," he said. "Her sister's confinement is near. The Lord will yet require our diligence." "Yes, sir," she said, and as soon as the words left her, she hated them for how smoothly they came. "Pray," he said, already in the aisle. Prayer cleans the residue. When he had gone, she remained. The chapel felt emptier with only her in it than it had when he stood there filling the space with his shape and scripture. The wind made a sound like a kettle in the throat of the stovepipe. She rose and walked without meaning toward the front pew, the one with the shallow nick in the back rail where a restless boy's penknife had slipped. The cushion there had been mended with a stitch too long, so it puckered like a healed wound. She sat. The room breathed around her. In the hush, a sound came up from the floor. Not the mothy thrum now, not the kettle whine, something softer, like breath taken into a small chest. It threaded the boards beneath her shoes, slid along the grain as if the wood itself had grown a mouth. She stilled until even her heartbeat seemed disrespectful of the silence. The iron door 30 feet away shed a faint warmth, a remembered heat that made a haze in the air. "Stay," said a voice that was not quite a voice from the seam between two planks. Evangeline did not move. The word did not come from outside or inside. It came from a third place, the place where all the nights she had woken with the taste of ash sat lined up like bottles on a shelf. She thought of the women in the back of the chapel, their eyes lowered, the flesh at the base of their thumbs shiny from the habit of gripping their own hands too hard. She thought of her mother, whose face she could no longer call into the mind's eye without also calling the shape of the Reverend's shadow falling over it. She thought of her own infant. No, she would not. But the thought slid under the door she tried to hold and stood with her in the aisle. Patient as weather, she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and let her head hang. Her scalp ached where she had pulled her hair back too tight that morning. A curl escaped and tickled her temple. She did not brush it away. Somewhere in the rafters a draft found a gap and worried it. A cinder in the ash belly of the furnace cracked and became two cooler things. A faint flake of soot lifted and fell and left a small gray kiss on the toe of her shoe. "Stay with us," the almost voice said. Plural now, a braid. A murmur pulled through many tiny throats or none. "It is cold." "Lord," she said, though the word felt like a garrison word, a word that held nothing she could use. "Lord." A bench somewhere behind her creaked as if a weight settled into it for the first time in years. She did not turn. She had learned that looking directly at a thing sometimes dismissed it. Out of the corner of her sight, the aisle seemed to darken and pale by turns, as if clouds had found a sun that wasn't there and kept passing over it. She imagined, no, not imagined, only feared, that if she looked, the pews would be filled with a congregation she could not count and could not name because they had never been named. She pressed her palms together the way she had seen white women do, and did not know if she meant it as prayer or as a brace. "Evangeline," the voices said, not a coin in a preacher's mouth this time, but the soft way a mother might say it to keep a baby from startling. "Stay." She stood abruptly then, as if the movement itself were a rope she could climb. The pew protested. She turned her back on the iron door, on the aisle, on the imagined congregation of ash, and faced the narrow vestibule with its table of tracts and the wooden peg where a good hat would hang. Her legs were hollow reeds under her. She thought of running. She thought of the yard path and the yard dogs and the dark house where Mrs. Barrow's sleeping, pinched face would float above the white stack of her night things. She thought of how the snow would take her footprints and hold them up for anyone to read. The wind allowed itself a long laugh through the door seam, as if amused by her calculations. She took one step, then another. Her hand closed over the iron doorknob. It bit her with its old cold. Before she could turn it, the sound came again. Not words now, but a lullaby without tune, the shape of a song. Her knees felt briefly like they were not her own. She did not turn back. She had that much discipline left, but she laid her forehead against the plank of the door. And for a moment in that awkward posture she was a child again in some other doorway, outside a room where someone had not yet died and might not if a small girl stood as still as a stone and made bargains with the air. A flake of paint came loose under her breath and rode the draft away. When she finally opened the door, the night felt warmer than the chapel had, which was wrong. The wind met her with the smell of the marsh, iron and weed, and carried the faintest odor of smoke from someone's hearth far down the road. The stars were a rash of cold pinpricks rubbed raw by clouds. Behind her, the chapel let out the same small plank cry it always did when the door was disturbed. And when she closed it, the latch took the decision out of her hands and made it final with a clean, unforgiving click. She descended the steps slowly, like an old woman lowering herself into a tub. Snow squeaked under her shoes. On the last step she paused, for the air had changed. She could not have said how, and she knew, as surely as she knew the names of bones and fevers, that if she turned back, she would see the window over the altar lit from within by a heatless blue, and behind that window shapes that were not the saints anymore. She did not turn. She went down into the rutted path, her breath a small engine churning in the cold, and set herself toward the Barrow house where she would not sleep. The chapel stood behind her, shouldering the dark like a man ill at ease in a coat that did not quite fit. In its throat, behind the iron door, the embers rearranged themselves once more and sighed. The lullaby wound itself around the rafters and made, in the strict geometry of the New England roof, the gentlest, most unbearable cradle. She walked faster. If this opening gripped you, subscribe and comment below. What do you think truly lurks inside the Ashcroft furnace? Ghosts, guilt, or something worse? Dawn came colorless as skimmed milk, and the chapel looked less like a house of God than a barn no one claimed. Frost filmed the panes inside as neatly as if a glazier had come in the night to seal holiness from the weather. Evangeline Mercer lit no lamp. She found the ewer at the font and dipped her scalded hands into water that had grown teeth in the cold. The sting steadied her. Red fissures laddered her knuckles where the iron latch had kissed them. Ash had worked itself into the cuts, a shadow that soap could not lift. She rubbed hard enough to abrade, stood there until her breath quickened and her eyes leaked without permission. From the yard below, The barrow rooster crowed late, as if daylight had had to argue for admission. Somewhere a pair of men, probably mill hands or drovers, moved along the road, their talk making small puffs on the air. Rail spur this spring, so they said, if Providence and Survey both agreed. The country was turning cunning, mills rising on old streams. Posters went up in Hartford and Boston about runaways, and men who claimed to know God's will better than God himself spoke of laws that would return flesh to owners the way a ledger returns sums to columns. In the Barrow house, Mrs. Temperance Barrow kept the parlor shades at half-mast and read tracts about the sins of abolition, while her sister Hester Lyle, 30 and sickly with confinement, prayed over the unkindness of pain. The Barrow men read newspapers that smelled of ink and freight and congratulated themselves on reading. Evangeline dried her hands on a towel that had seen too many winters. She had slept in the chapel loft again, on a pallet of straw between hymnals gone green with damp and the box of fans folks used in August. Sleep had not kept its promises. The night had been a hammock that dumped her every time she grew heavy enough to trust it. Twice she woke to find her palms pressed to her breastbone as if holding in a name that wanted to escape. Once she woke with her fingers blackened, though she had not touched the stove. In her dress pocket, someone had placed a flake of something thin and burned. After she examined it under a slant of light, she saw it had once been clothed with a scalloped edge, baptism trim. She told herself she had put it there. She told herself many things. She laced her stays and bound a kerchief tight over her hair, tugging it hard enough to quiet the tremor in her scalp. At the altar rail, she knelt to scrub out an unseen stain. Habit pressed on habit until the body did the day's small obediences by itself. The iron door below stayed shut, but the chapel's timber bones seemed to carry a pulse from somewhere. It was not the wind's moan that she knew. This was softer, 2 beats, then 1, as if a small heart was trying to practice. The vestibule door murmured open, bringing with it a blade of air and a smudge of daylight. Deacon Phineas Crowthorne scraped the snow from his boots on the sill with the carefulness of a man who believed in hierarchies of dirt. He was broad through the shoulders with a bull's neck, but time had thinned his hair to a salt and pepper that did not know where to settle. He held the ledger close against him, cradle tight. "Morning," he said, his voice a reed rustled by the marsh. He did not greet her with her name. He did not greet most with their names. Names implied a future with a shape. Deacon. She kept her eyes on her scrubbing as if the wood might show her something if she asked nicely. He crossed the nave as if counting boards. He always counted. She had seen him do it when the plates were passed, when the offering was low, when some widow had to pass the dish without contributing because God had not made a crop. He took out the pencil that lived along his ear and opened the ledger to yesterday's page. A clean line of entries marched there in an obedient column. Date, hour, initials of the woman, marked to indicate purity achieved, scripture to tuck the act under a blanket. Phineas's handwriting was schoolmaster neat, as if the letters themselves might keep the bodies from rising. He licked the pencil point as if to sweeten it and made a small square in the margin next to last night's hour. "There," he said, "the Lord loves order. The Reverend's sermon next Sabbath will take from Numbers. He is resolved, sir." Evangeline kept her tone even as she wrung her cloth. "The people hesitate," Phineas said, innocent of the word women. "Old blood, foreign blood, new temptations. We live in a time of loosening. You've seen the voters. You've seen the handbills in the tavern, promising liberty without labor and salvation without sacrifice. But the Reverend knows. Soft doctrine damns twice. First the body, then the town." He looked toward the iron door as if expecting it to answer. The morning had not warmed much, but a small exhalation rolled against their shins, the way a cat might pass without declaring itself. Phineas squinted. "You keep the fire," he said. Not quite a question, not quite condemnation, and ran his palm over the ledger as if to pet it. "A necessary office. In my father's time, such business would have been handled by the brethren. But women," there he used the word after all, safe inside a thought that made them plural and faceless, "have a steel for certain duties that men mistake for cruelty." "You do not make a mistake." Evangeline felt her jaw click once as if a tooth had shifted. She did not answer. Where Barrow's hunger hid in scripture, Phineas hid his in lines and squares, jokes and reckonings. He had a wife who had grown small under his keeping, like a plant left in the same pot too long. He had two sons who wore their boots in the house. Once, Evangeline had seen him stand in the porch light and pick his teeth with a sliver of kindling, while he read the ledger by the glow. She would not have trusted him with a fever, a lie, or a secret. Something, air, thought, memory, moved behind the iron door. Evangeline did not look. Phineas glanced toward it and then away, both too quickly for a man who believed only in what he could line up in columns. "The fire is sound," he said, as if to reassure himself. "It is the devil's murmurs you hear in a draught. The devil rides smoke the same as a mosquito rides a summer room." Evangeline soaked her cloth anew, wrung, and pressed the water into a ring on the rail until the wood gave up its stain as if tired of arguing. When she straightened, the room tilted a fraction. Such a slight listing that someone who had slept fine might not have felt it. The kerchief bound tight around her skull held her inside herself like a hoop around a barrel. Phineas sniffed and drew his shoulders back until Seams whispered, "You will attend Mrs. Lyle at the parsonage," he said. Her pains took a cockcrow, then stilled. "The Reverend fears a stubborn child. He has prayers ready. He trusts your hands. He trusts my hands," she thought. And a peculiar warmth flooded her chest that was not pride and not gratitude. How many doors in this town opened on account of what her hands could lift, wash, set, soothe? Any point of entry she had in this world came not because she was wanted, but because the ailing, the birthing, or the guilty required a pair of steady instruments. Tools, her fingers, a measure, her pulse. Men could speak doctrine. Women, if permitted, kept people from bleeding to death under it. "I'll go at once," she said. "Do," Phineas replied. "And He stopped himself before the rest of her name's syllables could turn human in his mouth. "Do." He closed the ledger, bound it with the strap, and slid the pencil back into the furrow his ear had made for it. At the door he paused, squinting at the windows. "Storm tomorrow," he predicted. "Candlemas near. The Reverend will preach severity. The Lord prefers us braced." He left, taking the cold with him. When the latch settled, it came back, denser somehow, with a smell under it like the opened belly of a stove that has burned more than wood. Evangeline tidied the altar tools and put on her cloak. She took the back stairs down into the crypt because the front stair always rang a note that stepped on the end of her thoughts. Down there, brick and soil met in a long marriage. The air carried old damp mouse talk, a snippet of hymn sigh that had gotten lost and couldn't find the door. She did not mean to go to the furnace. She meant to fetch her shawl where she had dropped it the night before when the latch had scalded her. But once in that low room, her feet navigated by a map they had learned without her permission. The iron stood in the gloom, a squat god in a black altar. A chain, dutiful and ugly, looped through a staple in the wall to hold the door at rest, as if the chapel itself was not sure the hinge remembered its manners. The nested bricks above the door had been whitewashed once. Now they had taken on a nicotine color that reminded her of the inside of an old man's cheek. She put out her hand. The surface was cold. The cold was a lie. Behind the metal, some ember practiced the trick of surviving dawn. Something soft tapped her forearm. Not sound, not touch, a suggestion that one might be mistaken for the other. She withdrew, heart knocking the wrong rhythm. On the brick next to the door, a small print marked itself. Not ink, not soot exactly either. It was the sort of gray one sees on the bellies of moths in a flower bin. 4 whorled digits, a thumb stub, the arch of a palm, the size of a newborn's hand, italic and insistent. Evangeline closed her eyes. There were 1,000 explanations for a mark. There were 1,000 fewer for a mark shaped like that. Not now, she said to herself. She told herself many things, and went up out of the cellar into a light that had not yet chosen to be day. The parsonage sat close by like a chick riding a hen's warmth. Mrs. Temperance received Evangeline at the kitchen entrance with a mouth set for complaint. She wore a wrapper of good calico and a look that had never had to learn the language of want. "She is back and forth," Temperance announced without greeting. "Send me up and down, up and down. I declare I am a sister, not a bell pull." "Hester needs rest between the pains," Evangeline said gently, unpinning her cloak. Her voice was the only thing she owned that could warm a room if she asked it nicely. Temperance gave a little sniff of injury and drifted toward the parlor like a ship resenting its own draft. "The Reverend is making preparations," she called over her shoulder. "He has chosen verses. He says conference men in Hartford can prate about reform all they like. Ashcroft will keep to the straight road." Upstairs, Hester Lyle lay angled against pillows, panting small and regular. She had a pale, pretty face with fine pores that took powder sweetly. Her hair frizzed damp against her temples. Fear had made her eyes clever. She caught Evangeline's hand the way a drowning person might seize a rope and smiled as if surprised that the rope did not blame her for pulling. Pains have their own clock, Evangeline said. We will read it as it runs. She arranged linens. She set water to heat. She laid out her surgeon's little kit, a spoon, a needle threaded and boiled, the laudanum on which she kept a lowered opinion. She listened with her fingers at Hester's belly, counting quietly. The intervals widened, then crept close, then walked off again like a child sulking through a chore. Between spasms, Hester whispered. Temperance says it is God's trial. But Christ never had to fit inside a woman's bones, did he? Evangeline's mouth twitched. Not as far as I've read, she said, and the smallest laugh loosened the air. The room forgave them both for a breath. When the next pain took Hester, Evangeline pressed her hip, worked the small of her back, showed her the trick of breathing slowly against the want to run. Outside, snow began to fuss, fine at first like sifted flour. Mid-morning, the Reverend came, book in one hand, Hester's wrist in the other. He felt her pulse with a theologian's attention, as if he might count a doctrine into it. We shall have a righteous issue, he pronounced, and looked at Evangeline in that quick, possessive way that made her want to be made of wood. You will keep your mind guarded. No sentiment, no superstition. The devil prowls in birthing rooms, same as he does in stoves. He left a prayer in the air like a fly in sugar water and went out again to shamble the town into piety. His boots left 2 black ovals on the parsonage runner, and Temperance followed those shapes with a cloth as if she could erase whatever part of him did not fit her floor. The day narrowed around its own throat. Hester dozed, then woke with a small cry and clutched Evangeline's sleeve so hard the seams held a memory of her for hours. Once, when Evangeline stepped into the hall to fetch more water, she heard something from downstairs. The iron kettle on the hob rattle, the stovepipe whistle. No, not that. She heard the furnace, and the parsonage had none. A faint, patient heartbeat came through the walls from the direction of the chapel, steady as a metronome laid to a baby's chest. She pressed her palm flat to the plaster and felt it answer, twice then once the way it had in the nave. Do not, she told the wall. Do not name me. When Hester at last took a long, easy breath between storms, Evangeline crept to the window and pushed the sash a finger's width. The air that stung her cheeks smelled of snow and coal, and something else, a sweetness that did not belong to any kitchen. She touched her breast absently through her bodice, and her fingers came away gray. On her kerchief, right over the place where a lullaby would steady a child's ear, a small ash handprint lay whole and perfect, as if a very tiny passenger had stood up to see the road. Evangeline put her lips to the fabric. Perhaps she meant it as a benediction. Perhaps she meant it as an apology. Perhaps the body finds its own sacraments when none are given. The furnace's pulse quickened once. From the chapel, though there were yards of cold and snow between, a whisper unspooled itself, bringing a name that was not Barrow's Bible name for mercy, and was not Phineas's ledger name for purity. It was the name Evangeline's mother had sung to a daughter in the yard under the wash line, a long time ago. When summer still believed in itself, Evangeline closed the window and turned back to Hester with a face she knew how to hold steady. When the next pain came, she bent her head and worked as if the world could be kept intact by pressure applied to the right muscle. Outside, the chapel shed a flake of paint into the snow. It lay there like a tooth. If the voices and the ledger of fire are getting under your skin, subscribe and comment. Are these hauntings real, or the weight of guilt pressing through wood and iron? Sunday dressed the town in its cleanest silence. Even the crows, bold all week in the corn stubble, had taken themselves elsewhere, leaving only their black punctuation in the snow. The morning was brittle bright, sunlight falling with all the warmth of spilled needles, wind stiff with iron. Ashcroft Chapel loomed over the road like a sentence without a period, daring the parishioners to walk themselves inside it and be ended. They came all the same, as they always did. Farmers' wives in shawls the color of dishwater, their mouths buttoned, men smelling of cold iron and pipe stems, 3 children bundled into one muff, the smallest one's boots on the wrong feet. The Reverend Josiah Barrow stood at the vestibule, lean and straight as a fencing post, nodding his acknowledgement with all the warmth of a doorframe. Deacon Phineas Crowthorne ushered them to their pews as if aligning chessmen. Evangeline stood at the side aisle, near the stove, where she could keep one hand on its pipe as though it were the wrist of a fevered patient. She had been awake for 31 hours. Hester Lyle still labored at the parsonage, slow as molasses in January, her body stopping and starting as if it feared where the road ended. Evangeline had snatched minutes of half-sleep in the corner chair, and once on the loft stair she had dreamed standing upright that a white-haired infant was swaddled around her heart, whispering not words but breathing, and when she woke she was already walking back toward the chapel, pulled like a needle to lodestone. Now the pews filled, the hymn books creaked open, and Barrow mounted the pulpit like a crow to a weathered limb. His cassock made no sound. He opened his Bible with ceremony, though he had long since memorized every page. His gaze swept the room and snagged briefly on Evangeline as though to remind her she was part of the furniture. He began in Genesis, voice soft as damp paper. The fall of Eve, he said, had not merely tainted her descendants but stained the very pattern of their flesh. Corruption hid in certain bloods as rot hides in the marrow of an apple. The Lord had made fire for cleansing. Men who feared its work only revealed their preference for sin. His words collected like frost on the chapel rafters. The congregation nodded like cattle learning the halter. A child sneezed. No one moved. Evangeline stared at her hands folded in her lap. The nails were clean. The cracks at her knuckles had scabbed to brown. They looked like someone else's hands, hands that had once cupped cold water, once pressed down a woman's belly to still a hemorrhage, once coaxed a gasp from a blue infant until life flushed up from its root like spring sap. And yet here they were, folded like obedient wings, while Barrow named her shape as curse and her labor as purification. Her gaze wandered to the ceiling beams. The sunlight slanted in pale bars through the frost-filmed windows. Inside those bars floated motes of ash, not dust, not pollen, ash, falling slow as if underwater. They turned and turned, each one giving off a glint like an eye at the instant before it closes. She blinked hard. They were gone. But a smell had arrived, faint as a rumor, scorched milk and singed cloth. The Reverend struck his palm once against the Bible, and the sound startled the pew boards into shuddering. "We must be fearless," he intoned, "in pruning what bears not fruit. Mercy is not indulgence. Mercy is fire rightly aimed." His voice boomed through the nave, then seemed to plunge down through the floorboards into the stone cellar. There, far below, something stirred in answer. The iron door gave a single slow creak without moving, as if it were shifting its spine. The stove beside Evangeline went briefly cold. A breath soft as a lullaby stroked her ankle bones. She did not flinch. If she flinched, someone might see. The sermon ended as all Barrow's sermons ended, with a verse from Leviticus and a look as sharp as a flint struck on steel. The congregation filed out like mourners. Their boots tracked salt lines on the black burlap aisle runner. As the last hymn sigh faded, the chapel's silence came roaring back in, huge and watchful. Phineas lingered, gathering abandoned tracts. He caught Evangeline watching the windows. "You see something," he said without turning his head. "Only the draft," she said. He made a dry little laugh, more bark than humor. "Best not to see more than your office requires. Doubt is like mildew, finds the soft places." He left with his ledger hugged close, hat brim low as if weather were personal. Evangeline waited until the yard had swallowed the last parishioner. Then she rose and crossed the nave barefoot to keep the boards from scalding. She knelt, lifted the trap hidden beneath the altar rail, and descended the narrow stair to the crypt. Down here, the chapel became another creature. The air was damp and thick as wool, tasting of copper. Mortar wept from between the field stones. The single lantern she carried made the shadows leap like things too thin to walk. The furnace squatted at the room's far wall, its iron skin blotched from decades of kindling and refusal. Its door was shut, yet warmth radiated from it in slow, invisible waves, as if it remembered an argument it meant to resume. She held the lantern high and saw them, behind the furnace, where a stone panel had cracked away from the wall, lay a hollow packed with fragments, small and brittle, pearled white, fused black at the edges, hundreds of them, crowded close as teacups on a shelf. Ribs no bigger than wishbones, femurs no longer than quills. Skulls like bird eggs collapsed in on themselves. The mound sloped nearly to the ceiling. Some pieces had melted together into grotesque new shapes, a knuckle soldered to an eye socket, two jaw arches braided like twine. Ash powdered her throat with each breath. Her mind tried to blink away what her eyes would not release. These were not ashes, as Barrow named them, nor sins, nor doctrine. These were children, and their silence pressed on her chest like a hand. Then they moved, not all at once. First just a shiver at the mound's crown, as if something very small had sighed. Then a stir like minnows in a pail. The fragments rattled together, dry porcelain kisses. A hum rose, thin and layered. Not words, not quite music. Something older than both. A rhythm too soft for living lungs, yet too steady for wind. It crawled into her skull and nested behind her eyes. Evangeline's knees went liquid. She gripped the furnace ring for balance. The metal scalded her palm. Still she did not release it. The hum braided itself into voices, not sharp, not accusatory, just insistent. A chorus sung through mouths that were not there. Stay. Her lips parted. No sound came out. The lantern flame drew tall, blue, motionless. From within the furnace itself came a glow. Not heat, but a pale light like moon milk, washing her face and showing her own shadow stretched long and warped against the opposite wall. In that shadow her arms rocked something. Her own lullaby rose from the bones, sung back to her in 30 paper-thin whispers. The cradle song her mother had breathed while combing her curls under the yard maple. The words had slipped from her memory years ago, but here they were, offered back in a language that scraped like charcoal on stone. Her heart pitched. She saw her daughter, her own daughter whose name she had never been permitted to keep, standing just behind the glow, eyes hollow as acorns, soot freckles across her cheeks like stars gone wrong. The child lifted one gray hand. Ash sifted from her fingers like snow. Evangeline, the child said, and her voice carried all the warmth of frost. Then she was gone. The light ebbed. The hum unraveled into the old stillness. The furnace sat dull and black as any other iron thing. The pile of bones lay quiet, though Evangeline thought their angles had changed, as if they had turned their ears to her. The board above groaned. She stiffened. Phineas stood on the stair, the lantern behind him making a nimbus of his thinning hair. "You do not belong down here," he said. His voice trembled, which frightened her more than if it had boomed. "That door is not for your eyes. I was cleaning," she lied. His gaze darted past her shoulder toward the furnace. "Cleaning?" He sounded as though the word had spoiled in his mouth. "Do you hear them?" She froze. The lie would not come fast enough. Phineas's lips pinched white. "Do not answer. Doubt makes a mouth of silence." He descended 2 steps, then stopped, nose twitching like a horse scenting fire. "The Reverend says the devil tries the faithful with mimicries. He comes as an infant sometimes. They cry without lungs." "I heard nothing," she said at last. His eyes, cold and pale as skim ice, fixed on hers. "Then you are favored." He turned and left, muttering scripture like a man rubbing salt into a wound. His boots thumped hollow up the stairs. The door closed, and the lock settled itself with an audible sigh. Evangeline sagged against the wall. Her heart galloped like it meant to escape her ribs. The bones said nothing now, but warmth pulsed faintly from the iron door, steady as a lullaby's beat. She pressed her forehead to the brick and whispered to no one, "I am still here." The furnace answered with a breath. Snow had begun falling when she emerged from the crypt, fine flakes drifting sideways in the crosswind like scripture too weary to land. The chapel loomed empty. The hymnals lay open on the pews as if the departed had left in haste. No sound but her pulse, and under it that other rhythm, faint and tireless like the world's own heart skipping. She lit no lamps as she locked the door. Through the warped glass over the altar she glimpsed something, just for a breath. Pale shapes watching from the inside of the window as if it were ice, and they were trapped beneath. Tiny hands pressed against the glass. Then they scattered like soot in a draft. Evangeline pulled her cloak tight. The furnace's warmth clung to her skin even out here in the wind. She knew, without knowing how, that it would never leave her now, and somewhere, down in the brick belly of the chapel, 100 unseen heartbeats tapped in time with her own. Would you open the furnace door to free them? Or run before they follow you? Subscribe and comment what you would do. All day the sky had been a lid about to tighten. By afternoon the wind ran low over the marsh with a thin metallic whine, and men in town pulled their collars up as if accused. At the parsonage Hester Lyle's labor stuttered and sulked. Evangeline kept the basin warm and the laudanum corked, reading the body's clock with her hands. When dusk arrived earlier than it should and set its shoulder against the windows, Reverend Josiah Barrow returned from his rounds with a face like an axe blade. "Candlemas draws," he said, coat powdered with flowery snow. "The Lord will hold us to account for our softness. Tonight we resolve." He looked past Evangeline toward Hester's belly, as if doctrine could be planted there and flower on command. "In the morning, if morning is given, no more wavering. All unclean issues," he said, and he did not blink, "shall be offered to the flame." Temperance Barrow gasped, then arranged her mouth into piety. Hester turned her face to the wall. Evangeline felt something go quiet behind her ribs, like a bird taught at last not to sing. "Storm coming," Barrow added almost with satisfaction, glancing toward the window where snow grains chased themselves in eddies like chalk ground under a heel. "The faithful will attend. The rest will mark themselves by absence. They did attend." The first flakes thickened to feathers, then to torn cloth, then to a siege. By full dark the road from the mill vanished under white that moved like a tide, and still lanterns bobbed through the drift toward Ashcroft Chapel. The bell, long dumb, could not have rung if asked. The storm took the duty in hand, clapping its cold palms along the siding until the whole structure shivered. The congregation stamped in, hats clapped, shawls shedding snow, cheeks and noses raw. The air tasted of wool and winter breath. Phineas Crowthorne shut the door with both palms as if holding back a crowd that wanted in. Barrow climbed to the pulpit. The stove in the nave sulked, groaning a little as logs settled, but no heat reached the pews. The windows were already blind with snow. Candle flames leaned like listeners. Evangeline stood at the far transept, hands clasped to still their impulse to be useful, and watched the people take their places as if the pew lids might close over them. Barrow's voice came measured, even at first, then gathering like a plow behind oxen. "Brethren," he said, using the word for everyone and meaning it less, "we have dallied with sentiment. We have mistaken pity for holiness. It ends now. Evil grows where we spare it. The taint of mixed blood and lawless seed has bred confusion among the people of God. We shall not make a hotel for iniquity. When the Lord gave the priests fire, he gave them duty. We will be clean." A murmur moved the length of the nave, not assent exactly, but the sound of people trying not to breathe too much. Temperance sat in the front pew with her hands pressed neatly together like unbaked bread, the bones white under her skin. Phineas stood sentinel at the aisle, the ledger already open to a blank page, pencil ready to domesticate the night. Snow ticked against the glass with the steady malice of small stones. Barrow extended a hand toward the chancel rail the way a man gestures to a knife he means to use. "Sister Mercer," he said, voice cut to shape, "you will make the fire ready." Evangeline felt the room step back from her. She moved anyway, because all her days had formed that habit, because refusal was a language no one had taught her letters for. At the altar, she knelt to lift the square of carpet hiding the trap. The stair yawned into the chapel's underground throat. Cold lined the walls going down. In the crypt, the furnace sat like an accusation. The chain that kept the door from flinging itself wide had been doubled since morning, as if someone had grown nervous on behalf of iron. She brought the lantern close and saw the loop of prints again, small gray palms and long thumb smears on the brick in a wrist-high drift, as if a line of children had queued here waiting their turn to touch. The sight made the air thin. She gathered kindling with hands that remembered without permission. Twist shavings, lay the cross, coax flame modestly, do not force. But the wood would not catch. The lantern's light showed the dry fibers trembling on their own, as if they knew a different fire was expected. Evangeline struck steel. A spark died on the iron door like a flea finding no blood. She struck again and again until her knuckles sang with it. Behind her, the stair creaked. Phineas descended, breath-white ledger under his arm. "You lag," he said. He knelt ungainly as a man forced to pray against his taste, and thrust the twist of shavings under the grate. The moment his flint kissed, a blue tongue took, and then a second, beautiful as glass, cold as moon. It gave no heat. It lit the room as lake ice lights the face of a boy who leans to see if it will hold. Phineas rocked back on his heels. "There," he whispered, grinning for the first time that night with a child's superstitious triumph. "The Lord's answer." Evangeline did not tell him that true fire murmurs as it eats, and this did not. She fed it the smallest sticks. They blackened without smoke and stood up straighter as if remembering a previous posture. The chain ticked once against the staple. Above, Barrow's voice rolled on. Scripture about purging leprosy from houses, then about cutting off offending hands to save souls. The words dripped through the floorboards like melted wax. The furnace door shivered under Evangeline's palm. She removed her hand and realized she had not meant to put it there. Phineas lifted the ledger to the light and licked his pencil. The flame made his eyes pale as coins. "Hour marked," he breathed. Commencement of the cleansing. They climbed. The nave had grown more crowded while they were below, or else the shadows had learned to sit. Snow glued itself to the windows in whirls. The stove had given up dignity and sulked outright. A draft ran along the floorboards like a ribbon of river water and encircled Evangeline's ankles. It felt like a child's arm. Barrow spread his hands as if blessing a crop. "Bring forth the unfit," he said. "The parish will not be mocked by sin." No one moved. The women kept their heads folded so the men would think their eyes were on their laps. Somewhere a baby, not the sort Barrow meant, a living child whose blood he would have counted proper, squirmed and fussed. The sound thinned and broke. In the back pew, an old man coughed once and then thought better of it. "Now," Barrow said, the word crisp as frost. Temperance rose uncertainly, then sat. Mrs. Cobb, who had already buried 3 children this year without assistance from doctrine, pulled her shawl tighter around her throat as if the order had blown a draft at it. Phineas's pencil hovered, impatient. The silence stretched until it became a thing with legs. The chapel answered first. It began with a settling sigh, the kind a building makes when night finds its joints. Then the rafters gave a small groan as if the weight upon them had changed. From the windows the snow's scratching ceased, as if the storm had put its ear to the glass to hear better. The candles brightened without smoke. Their light turned thin and milk blue. Along the aisle a dust rose, no, not dust. Ash lifting in parlor-sized whirls from beneath the pews, floating to knee-height and then higher, until it hung there like breath that refused to disperse. Someone whispered Jesus and mispronounced it with fear. Evangeline felt the hair along her forearms lift as surely as if a hand had brushed it backward. A soft tapping sounded under the floor, as of many small knuckles finding a table. The trap at the altar heaved just once as though the ground beneath it had decided upon a new shape. The iron in the furnace far below yawned, and at that same instant the stove in the nave went cold, a petty cruelty that made people feel singled out personally by winter. Barrow gripped the pulpit. For a moment, only an unpracticed fraction, you could see the man under the Reverend, a husband who leaves boots where wives will find them, a son who once pocketed a marble during a funeral, and has never since trusted his hands. Then his mouth found its accustomed corners. "Steel yourselves," he said, and the words skittered in the icy air and did not land. "Satan apes miracles, hold!" The ash swirled tighter, then resolved, each drift becoming almost a shape, a shoulder slope, the shallow basin of a skull, the suggestion of a hand that knew how to be cupped. At the front, in the aisle runner's black, a sequence of prints appeared, small as sparrows and just as purposeful, marking the burlap with gray ovals in a line that came forward from nowhere. The furnace door upstairs without being upstairs. That was how it felt. Opened. No hinge sound reached them. Yet every head turned as if to a noise. A light, thin and lovely as milk poured from a height flooded the chancel. It was not warm. It made the pew varnish look like a frozen pond. They came out of that light in the way snow appears, first one flake, then a pattern, then a host. Not solid, not smoke, not anything she could fold into a square of understanding. Infants, or the memory of their shape, crawling on elbows, lifting the round weight of heads that had never quite learned the trick. Their eyes were hollows full of ash that did not spill. Their mouths were not open and still managed to sing. Where their small hands touched the pew ends and the aisle runner, gray prints bloomed like frost ferns. The congregation inhaled and forgot to let the breath go. One of the little shapes reached the front pew and rested its arm across Temperance Barrow's gloved hand. Her spine curved as if her corset had suddenly softened. For a heartbeat she looked mothered. Then she snatched her hand back with a hiss and crushed her glove in her fist as if it had betrayed her. The print remained, lace mapped in ash. Another child ghost gathered itself at Deacon Phineas's feet and pressed its palm to his boot. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the ledger trembled. He pinned it hard under his palm as if paperwork could fix the world back to the old arithmetic. The pencil fell and rolled, making a sound too loud for such a small thing. Barrow lifted his Bible not to read but to wield. "Begone," he said. "You are the conveniences of hell." He reached for the authority in his voice and found, perhaps for the first time since he was a boy, that authority works differently when the thing before you has no interest in your fear. The lullaby rose, not sweet, not accusing, just the tune the world might hum to keep from remembering. It came from everywhere, in the furnace belly and the space under the tongue where words consider themselves. The pew boards answered with a small sympathetic creak like rocking. The children moved along the aisle, past Evangeline without touching her. She felt them nevertheless, a coldness that had nothing to do with winter, and everything to do with absence taught to make itself a shape. One paused and lifted its face to her. She recognized nothing and everything. Ash dusted her kerchief. A tiny weight leaned for the briefest moment against the hollow of her hip, like a lost cat leaning, then went on. From the balcony came a crack like a knuckle. The gallery rail flexed inward as if people leaned there to look, people who were not there. A spray of soot drifted down in the shape of hymn notes and landed on the open book in the front pew, spelling nothing that could be sung. Barrow left the pulpit. He stepped into the aisle with the Bible held high as if it might shed proper light. "This is delusion," he declared, and the word made a small circle around him and fell. "Sister Mercer, shut the door," I commanded. "Shut the door." Evangeline looked toward the chancel. No door was open there that she could touch. The door that gaped was in the place beneath places. The iron mouth she had tended with a dutiful care that now felt like complicity. "No," she said, and the sound of her refusal surprised her with its lack of tremor. She had not known she would say it until it stood between them. She felt something in her, something that had knelt for too many years, stand and set down the basin it had been carrying. Phineas made a thin sound between his teeth. "Do as your office—" "No," she said again, and the blue light climbed the walls as if approving. The first of the infants reached Barrow. It took hold of the hem of his cassock. Where its ashen fingers pressed, black fingerprints bloomed and sank into the cloth as water sinks into thirsty dirt. Barrow jerked back, but the cloth came with him as if nailed. His eyes found Evangeline's and flared. Anger first, then something that looked like a man encountering the plane of himself with no scriptures in between. He swung the Bible down. The infant did not move. The book passed through light and ash like a ship through fog and clapped his own thigh so hard he winced. Then the snow stopped, or rather the sound of it stopped. Silence rang, brass bright total, as if the storm had put a finger in its own mouth and reconsidered. The candle's blue waver steadied. The small shapes paused as if listening for permission from a quarter that had never given any. The stove exhaled. A single breath of warm air crept along the floorboards. Not enough to comfort, enough to remind. It carried with it a smell that stole every other smell. Scorched milk, starch burned at the iron, a sweetness no kitchen should know. "What would you have?" Evangeline asked the infants, the chapel, the night, quietly, the way one asks a fever to declare itself. Her voice did not carry. It threaded. What would right be if ever it were to visit? Something passed over the congregation like a hand smoothing wrinkled cloth. Backs softened. Mouths closed without orders. A woman near the rear began to weep without noise, tears leaving clean roads down her powder. Phineas dropped to one knee, not in prayer perhaps, but because knees know before men do when it is time to come down. Barrow took a step backward and found the pulpit behind him. His free hand grasped it as a drowning man took rope. He bared his teeth at the blue light as if it were weather he could scold. "You do not bargain with darkness," he said hoarsely. "You do not deal with it. You name it and you set it out. And if you misnamed it?" Evangeline asked. She did not know where the courage came from. Perhaps the song brought it like a tray. What if the darkness you served wore a collar? The blue brightened. The infant's lullaby braided into a harmony that found the chapel's old timbers and set them humming, as if the building were an instrument too long unplayed. Something beneath the floor, stone. Water, history answered low and patient, like a drum muffled in mourning cloth. "Close the door," Barrow said, and now his voice asked instead of told. Evangeline did not move. August, unearned, impossible. Moved through the chapel, though the doors were shut and snow banked high. It passed through the blue light and scattered it into motes. Each mote found a pew end, a hymn book, a shoulder seam, and sank. Where it settled, frost bloomed in delicate veins, Where a hand had been cruel, the veins grew thicker. Where a hand had been kind, despite instruction, the frost melted quickly and left the wood darker and somehow cleaner. Barrow's cassock drank a net of delicate white. He looked down, then up, then at Evangeline as if she were the only one in the room with a language he might learn. His lips formed mercy and could not say it. A soft weight leaned against Evangeline's knee. Without looking, she let her hand fall, palm open. The cool there was almost companionable. In the silent center of the night, with storm paused and scripture cut thin, she understood that the thing in the furnace had never been merely wrath. It was a memory kept too hot, too long, made volatile by hiding. She closed her fingers, not to capture, only to show she knew how to hold gently, and felt for a breath. A tiny knuckle pressed back. The blue light thinned like milk and water and drew inward, as though the children had decided something among themselves. The ash on the aisle runner heaved faintly and then settled. From the crypt, the iron door gave a single, decisive click, the sound of a latch finding its true notch after many years of pretending. The lullaby dwindled to the shape of song and then to the memory of a tune a mother might hum without knowing. The storm remembered its business and came back to the windows with a hiss. Someone in the back sobbed once like a man waking from a bad bed. A baby, living, red-cheeked mortal, yawned and squeaked and then slept again unbothered. Barrow sagged against the pulpit, breathing as if he had run a hill. He stared at the place where the blue had been. Phineas was still kneeling, lips moving like a child learning to sound letters. Temperance lifted her hand to her mouth and studied the ash lace on her glove, the way a woman studies the stitching by which a life holds. Evangeline stood in the aisle, hands at her sides, palms ash-dusted and steady. The chapel felt, not cleansed, not ruined, listening. She knew in her bones the night was not finished. No night that said about remaking names ever ends at once. But some hinge had taken its true pin. A door had shut or opened. The difference tonight seemed less than words would have it. Down in the earth under the altar, iron cooled by a breath. Outside, the road vanished. Inside, for a moment too brief to be anything but true, the air in Ashcroft Chapel remembered spring. Dawn broke as a rumor rather than a color. The storm had plowed all night, and now it lay in white heaves against the chapel walls, shouldering the siding like cattle at a trough. Inside, breath smoked in the nave. The candles, guttered to nubs, had left small yellow teeth in their brass cups. The people, those who had come to prove themselves faithful in the Reverend's arithmetic, sat raw-eyed in their pews, not speaking, as if a single word might knock the building loose from the small hold it still kept on the earth. No one had found sleep. The blue light had gone, but its after-image kept stepping in and out of the corner of every eye. The lullaby had thinned, retreated, then returned in a whisper no one would admit to hearing. All night the floor had given small answering taps, two then one, like a heart reminding a room that it had not quit. And under everything, the iron below had cooled by degrees, one stubborn mile of heat at a time, until its breath no longer fogged the minds of those who listened. Evangeline stood where the aisle met the chancel, hands clean of soot and not knowing what to do with that cleanliness. Cold stitched her up and down. She had bound Hester's last cries into her own ribs all afternoon. She had tended the furnace all evening. She had faced the night before, whatever name you gave it. And now there was morning, and she could not remember how to stand like someone who had learned obedience. She felt hollowed and somehow heavier. Reverend Barrow had not left the pulpit. The man had gone iron white during the night. He had met the blue with a Bible and found paper wanting, and the knowledge had shaved something off him he had counted as permanent. Now his hands lay open on the book's blank end papers as if he meant to read an unwritten chapter. The ash lace on his cassock had sunk into the wool, map-like and permanent. If he had prayed, it had been with his mouth closed. Deacon Phineas Crowthorne still knelt in the middle aisle. His knee joints had given up complaining about an hour before. Now they seemed welded to the runner. His ledger lay on the floorboards where it had fallen. Soot had blown across its open page and settled in the ruled lines like grain in furrows after wind. His pencil had rolled into the heatless mouth of the nave stove and stuck there, blackened to the length of a child's finger. The storm, having done all the harm it could to the roads, grew bored. It began to abate as children do. One last tantrum, then silence except for the odd insult tossed at a shutter hinge. Light, real light, not the milk blue of night's correction, sifted in through the warped panes. Under that gray kindness, the chapel revealed what the night had left. On certain pews, temperances, Mrs. Cobb's, the Jenkins family's, ash prints bloomed, hand-sized and infant, scattered like seashells after a tide, but each precisely placed on a palm or the meat beneath a thumb, each shading into the wood where a hand had rested. To Evangeline they read like notes in a ledger, not Phineas's, marks left by touch rather than decree. On other pews, where harshness had lived in silence even when Bibles were shut, outlines lay faint and eerie. A woman's shoulder curve, a man's sternum, gray stains hugging the boards, as if the night had asked for account and the wood had taken the shape of absence like a rubbing. No bodies lay in the shapes. The pews held coats and prayer books and a scattering of glove buttons and a child's red ribbon flattened into a wrinkle. But of the bodies that had warmed those clothes, half were missing. Not all the guilty, not all the innocent. The tally did not show the Reverend's sense of justice any more than it pleased the deacon's squared columns. It pleased nothing human. It simply was, a distribution written by some hand that valued truth over story. Temperance, rigid in the front pew, had one glove on and one in her lap. Her ungloved hand bore the ash lace without smudge. The pattern settled into the skin's whorls like a tattoo of frost. She did not cry. She had been taught that grief wastes bone, but her mouth had lost its instruction. It hung honest and unbeautiful. Phineas rose at last by inches, his body unmusicked by the effort. He picked up the ledger with 2 fingers as if it might bite, snapped it shut and shoved it under his coat as one hides a shame. He looked around as a man might look through a barn fire for the horse that trusted him. He found no creature to lead out, no rope to take. His eyes met Evangeline's and slid away as if he had seen in that moment that the world contained a vantage other than his, and it frightened him to admit how long it had stood within reach. Barrow straightened, and for a breath his mouth found its old corners again. "We will," he began. The word failed as a weak board fails under too much weight. He tried the next plank, "We shall," and the plank sank also. His voice softened to the size of his throat. "We must consider," he said finally, and looked at Evangeline as if there were instructions written on her face. She said nothing. The quiet owned her for good now. She knew it as land knows a fence line. Down below, the furnace sat dignified and dumb. It had learned overnight the trick of keeping its counsel. The click they had all heard had been a true hinge, a pin set back in place. The iron would respond to no more orders this season, perhaps ever. A child's thin cry pinned everyone's eyes to the door. It came from the road, not the nave, a new, ordinary mortal sound. Evangeline moved first. She shoved back the bolt and elbowed the heavy door open against a heap of drift. The morning stood there, indignant and bright with cold. On the chapel steps, Hester Lyle leaned against the jamb, hair loose, lips bloodless with the hard work of being the way flesh becomes a doorway. In her arms lay a baby, red as a cranberry and outraged by the change in air. Hester's eyes found Evangeline's with a look that held both terror and decision. "I would not," Hester said simply, breath smoking, voice ripped thin from the night. Behind her, Temperance, who had sworn she was a sister, not a bell pull, stood with a cloak around Hester's shoulders and a look as raw as the dawn. The chapel exhaled, though no stove fed it. Evangeline gathered them both into the nave on a wave of warmth she could not account for. She took the baby with the practiced sanctity of a woman who has pulled too many lives back from the shore and laid him, small and definite, against her shoulder. He quieted as if briefed on the new order. Barrow came down from the pulpit one stair, then another. 1,000 muscled habits crawled up his spine, demanding he say a thing that would make the morning fit the sermon he had sharpened his whole life. He reached the aisle and stopped. The ash lace on Temperance's glove, the open ledger's empty line, the red-faced complaint of Hester's child. None arranged themselves into scripture at his bidding. He had always believed that if one stood in the right spot and spoke the correct verse, the world would square itself like a table. The table refused. He lifted his hand anyway. "Reverend," Evangeline said so low it did not carry beyond him. The word did not plead. It warned perhaps or offered a gentler path. "Do not," she told him without accusing, "mistake memory for the devil again." He looked from the baby to the iron trap to the pew outlines to Evangeline. Whatever he had used for sight all these years altered. No man in the room could have said how. He lowered his hand, Outside, a farmer's wagon creaked up through the thawing drift, 2 oxen steaming, a wife with a shawl pulled over her mouth. Word traveled in New England faster than grain. Already the town would be making a story out of what could not be simplified. Some would blame the weather. Some would blame heathen blood. Some would mumble about the railroad and modern sins that rattled the ground like trains. A few in kitchens where the air stayed kind even when winter pried at the sash would whisper that something tired of lies had stood up in the night and taken a breath. By afternoon, those missing would not return. No footprints led away from the chapel. No bodies lay to be measured. At dusk, a violet light pooled in the nave. Not the milk blue of the night's visitation. Not holy, not unholy. Simply the hour's own bruise. And the pew outlines faded by degrees as if the wood had decided it would not commemorate any man unless he learned to ask. Temperance's glove could not be washed free of its ash lace, however she scoured. Later, she would learn to wear it quietly as certain women wear marriages. Phineas Crowthorne went home and placed his ledger face down at the back of a drawer. He shut it with a care his wife had never been afforded and did not open it again. When a spring boy was brought to his door blue from the pond, it was Evangeline he fetched. And when she breathed the child back, he stood aside and did not claim the miracle. Reverend Josiah Barrow kept his pulpit. New England men do not set down tools they have argued themselves into loving, but something in his preaching gave up its measuring instruments. He spoke less from Leviticus and more from winter wheat and thaw. He said mercy, as if discovering the vowel in the middle for the first time. No one stopped counting sin. They only sometimes counted the cost. As for the furnace, spring found it slick with a bloom of pale rust like lichen. In summer, children dared one another to touch its door, and came away with gray smudges they wiped on their own shirts rather than the pew ends. In autumn, when the first cold gathered under the chapel's skirt, the men consulted and brought a new stove up from Hartford with a mouth like a contented dog. The old iron in the crypt remained, chained politely, a relic to be explained away when the country's laws demanded explanations and the trains shook the ground with modern insistence. Evangeline, the town told this part a dozen ways, was found 3 days later on the Salt Hay Road moving slowly, as if carrying a load too delicate to jostle. Her hair had whites in it that had not been there in January. In her arms, wrapped in a shawl that had known both work and sorrow, lay nothing the eye could count. Still her body cradled that absence with a tenderness so practiced it looked like possession. When asked where she had been, she said only, "Listening," and laid 2 coins on the apothecary's counter to pay for laudanum she did not use. The women who had worked beside her in kitchens and sick rooms took her into their parlors anyway. The men who had raised their hats stiffly before now did so with something like respect. In the year of the Fugitive Slave Act, with posters pasted on tavern doors like warrants for hope, small courtesies became acts of defiance. Hester's boy lived. He grew with a temper like weather, quick, sometimes rough, but faithful to the seasons of kindness, and he stood very young on his first Candlemas and said, in the nave where the pew board still remembered more than the town would say aloud, "Sing again." Hester hushed him, but her mouth smiled into her shawl where only Evangeline could see. The chapel slumped and leaned and kept the habit of Sundays. Travelers on the Boston Road learned to point up the knoll and say, "That's where the furnace was," the way people name a thundered tree. In certain lights, and for those who had listened once until listening changed their bones, the windows showed small handprints from the inside on frost mornings. No more than the suggestion of fingers, no less. The bell never found its tongue again. Perhaps it had decided there was a sound beyond ringing, a quiet that meant more. And on nights when snow falls vertically and the marsh goes to glass, some swear a woman crosses the knoll with her shawl tucked carefully around something she refuses to set down. Her steps leave no mark. The wind, witnessing, goes gentle for a dozen breaths and then remembers to be winter. Those who have done wrong without admitting it lock their shutters and say the cold is bad for old joints. Those who have loved well despite instruction step outside bareheaded. Let the frost write a harmless ache across their scalps, and listen until the lullaby, no sweeter now, only truer, takes the measure of their hearts and sets them back in the harness they can pull without cruelty. Ashcroft Chapel outlasted the decade by stubbornness and nails. When at last the roof caved under a March storm, and the steeple gave up its argument with wind, the men carted away clapboards for sheds and left the foundation ring to grass. The crypt stayed. If you stand on that spot, if you don't bring a story, if you allow memory to do the talking, you will feel a small warmth where no flame burns. It is memory forgiven enough to stop harming people and strong enough to keep them honest. It is the opposite of a purge. Evangeline grew old. She allowed the town to say the word when they placed it on her with the same careful hands they now use to lift an infant. She sang to the living and kept silent with the dead. Some said she had made peace with Barrow. Some said she had taken his wife's hand in winter and warmed it with her own. Some said the deacon learned to carry loaves rather than ledgers. None agreed on the truth, which is how you can tell a thing matters. And when Evangeline's last winter came and the pond hammered, itself quiet, and the marsh geese wrote their black sentences above the town, and the children with clean hands wriggled in their good clothes in the back pew, someone began, no one remembers who, the softest melody, the one with no verse and no doctrine, the one that learned to stop asking for payment. It filled the chapel as water filled a hollow and did not wash anyone away. If the iron down there, what's left of it, remembered, it kept its counsel. Some hinges, having found their true pins, do not swing again. They keep doors honest. At the very last, a chimney swallow dropped through an eave and scribbled the nave with its fast, joyful pen, as if to sign the story before anyone else could. The wind took the hint and turned toward spring. If this ending stayed with you, subscribe and comment below. Was the Ashcroft purge a haunting, a judgment, or a memory finally telling the truth?